Hello and welcome to this discussion on Psychiatric Advance Directives and the CARE Act. This module is designed to increase equitable and person-centered care and providing this best practice of Psychiatric Advance Directives to improve the CARE Act process. A note on some related trainings. So you can see on our website a number of trainings that we have available. A couple trainings we wanted to highlight are about supported decision-making. So there's a supported decision-making module specific for the supporter role, and then also a training that's more geared towards implementation teams. So view those resources. They go hand in hand with PADS. And we'll briefly talk about supported decision-making, but you can go to our website to find more information. Now I want to introduce you to some of our speakers today. We have a great group of people representing varied perspectives on psychiatric advance directives and how they've been used, how some innovations happening in the state of California to make them more effective, and how PADS can really be used as a lifetime tool. So we have Rachel Johnson-Yates and Dari Pogash from Health Management Associates, and we're joined today by Rachel Chambers of Painted Brain and Karen Sahada from Concepts Forward Consulting, and they'll be speaking to their work in PADS and their engagement in different stakeholders in the state of California and some lessons they've learned and recommendations they have for PADS moving forward. So I'll briefly go over the objectives for today's session and preview the sections of today's training and then dig into the content. So we hope that by the end of this module, you will have an increased ability to describe the importance of psychiatric advance directives or PADS for documenting client preferences and ultimately supporting self-determination. Also, we'll hope that you're better able to summarize person-centered components to be included in a PAD, and also be able to articulate some steps for implementing PADS as part of the care process. On the agenda, we see the first section, we're going to be focusing on the background and purpose of PADS and how they relate to healthcare advanced health directives and how they're similar to and different from those legal formats. And then also the second section will focus on PADS in practice and some moments in the CARE Act when they can come in, and then some when, who, how, and what of PADS, and look at some sample templates. So as we go into the first section, I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, Dari, to go over the background and purpose of PADS. Dari?
Thanks, Patricia. We can go to the next slide. Here's a definition of PADS we're going to use as a level-setting definition for the presentation today. A PAD is a self-directed legal document that details a person's specific instructions or preferences regarding future mental health treatment. It's used to plan for the possibility that someone may lose the capacity to give or withhold informed consent to treatment during acute episodes of psychiatric illness. It allows a person in a mental health crisis to retain their decision-making capacity by choosing trusted agents to help advocate for their choices. This definition comes from the Innovations Project that my co-presenter, Kieran, is the director of and will be speaking on later in the presentation. And just to give you some legal background on where does a PAD come from. So like Patricia said, I'm an attorney by training, and I actually spent the first several years of my career representing individuals with disabilities, including mental illness, for the District of Columbia's Protection and Advocacy Program for people with disabilities. And one of the most meaningful projects that I worked on during that time was assisting individuals, primarily in inpatient psychiatric facilities, in completing a PAD. So it's a subject I'm familiar with, and I also understand the significance of having a legally enforceable document. In the state of California, PADS are, the reason the PAD is legally enforceable is because it originates from the Advanced Healthcare Directive law. In other words, a PAD can be classified as a kind of healthcare directive, although that does come with some limitations given that that statute is specifically addressing advanced healthcare directives. The statute was recently amended to include mental health decisions. I also want to point out that there is a registry, a California State Registry, where advanced healthcare directives can be registered, and we do include the link to that registry in the presentation notes. Next slide, please. So what's the purpose of a PAD? A PAD can be used to plan for a future event in which an individual may not be able to direct mental and physical treatment. It provides an opportunity to outline preferences and share that with others. It supports an individual's autonomy, dignity, and ability to self-direct care, and it improves that person's ability to inform the community, build trust, and navigate care systems. And I know that this last point about making the PAD really the center of a community focus, Kieran's going to address that again in her presentation, because it's really significant that a PAD is something that is recognized and accessible by all the various individuals in the community that may come into contact with a person either during the course of their mental health treatment or when they have a crisis, when they're experiencing a psychiatric crisis. Next slide. There's evidence of a PAD's effectiveness. So like I said on our last slide, a PAD can increase client autonomy and dignity, and that's something that I can say from personal experience. It's certainly the case for clients that I assisted with completing a PAD. And studies, it's not just my own experience, but there are studies that have shown that individuals who use PADs experience feelings of autonomy, self-determination, and empowerment. PADs also can increase treatment adherence after discharge, including medication. And those who have a PAD are much less likely to receive coercive intervention during a mental health crisis. Next slide, please. So I invite you to think, when we're talking about a PAD, about the PAD being really a blueprint for consumer-driven, trauma-informed, and person-centered care. What the PAD does is it allows the individual to prepare in advance of a crisis and to inform their care preferences. The PAD is, in some ways, a structure or a model for how supported decision-making can inform patient care. And we have provided a training on supported decision-making that's available on the CARE Act website. The PAD lasts a lifetime as long as it's not revoked by the author, by the person who is the subject of the PAD. And it's a legally defined tool that can be updated as needed and applied during a crisis. So it's flexible, right? It can ebb and flow along with the person's mental health journey. And it provides a menu of options to meet the individual's needs. And these options are significant. First, there's the advance directive part of the PAD, where the individual can identify all kinds of categories that are relevant to their treatment, like medications, medical mental health treatment preferences, psycho and social crisis approaches, personal needs. The other thing a person can do within the PAD is appoint a proxy decision maker and supporter. And this is in some ways analogous to a healthcare power of attorney. Next slide, please. I mentioned supported decision-making earlier. I always like to include this definition, again, as the basis of our conversations about supported decision-making. Supported decision-making is one of the underlying principles of the CARE Act, and it's certainly a tool that can be used when implementing a PAD. So in the context of the CARE Act, that might be the volunteer supporter, but generally when an individual is completing their PAD, they may turn to others in their decision-making network to help them think through all these really significant decisions about their treatment, while the PAD recognizes, as under a supported decision-making framework, that ultimately the decisions are always up to the individual. Next slide. So this is not a prescriptive model for how to create a PAD by any means. It's one example of how the steps might work out. So first of all, the person has to have the desire and the ability to document their preferences. You can't write a PAD for someone else. It has to come from the individual. And then they work with supports to develop over several sessions. Again, that's where I'm referencing a supported decision-making framework. sharing the pad with relevant individuals and organizations. This is so important. In my work as an attorney, part of the course of my representation with helping folks fill out a pad, helping my clients, was to make sure that their treatment team had a copy, that we had the opportunity to discuss the pad at a treatment team meeting, and to share the pad with anyone else that the person requested that it be shared with. We've talked about how the pad really needs to be a flexible document and updated as needed and used in time of crisis. Next slide. So when does a pad become effective? So like I've said, a pad is always effective in the sense that once it's written, it's always available to the client to use when they choose. But it's also can be, is obviously significant in a moment of crisis when the person may not be able to communicate their wishes for themselves. And going back to the theme of a lifetime tool, a pad can be used to inform preferences for communication and de-escalation on a daily basis. And I know some of my clinical colleagues have talked about the significance of a pad in the course of mental health treatment, how useful it is for the team to have as a blueprint for the person's desires for their care. A pad can absolutely be changed and revoked. The person has to have the desire and the ability to change it. And it's really significant to understand, though, that we have to track who has copies of the pad and make sure that they get the updated copy. So a person can verbally or in writing revoke their pad, but the individuals who already have the receipt of the pad, in particular their mental health treatment team, they have to be informed of that change or they're going to continue to use the old directions. Next slide. So I've just talked about, what I think of as the ideal framework for a pad, but I want to acknowledge there are many systemic barriers to implementation. First, like I've referenced a couple of times, the lack of access to an individual's pad. So how do we make sure that everyone who needs to know about the pad knows about it and also knows when it's been updated? This is adjacent to this point that an individual who is receiving mental health treatment and may be at risk of a crisis is going to be involved with multiple systems. And so do those systems talk to each other? Do they all know about the pad? How do we get service delivery systems like hospitals, clients, and families to recognize pads? What is our public awareness campaign to make sure that people understand what they are and respect them as a legally enforceable document? And, lack of supports. I've talked about supported decision-making, and that's a decision-making model. It's an ideal framework, but many of the individuals who are writing pads, they may not have anyone in their network. They may not have friends and family that they feel comfortable working with or consulting with while they're developing a pad. And then finally, we have a lack of recovery-focused templates and facilitation of pads. And so I've just laid out some of these barriers. There's this exciting new pilot program, the innovations program. And so I'm going to hand the mic over to Kieran to talk more about how the program is responding to these barriers.
Thank you, Dari. And as Dari said, my name is Kieran Sahota, and I am the lead project manager for our multi-county innovations PADS project here in California with 7 counties. And my background is 25 years of county mental health as well as law enforcement CIT training. And so this project definitely is an amazing project in California right now. And in agreement with what Dari is saying with the some of the barriers is part of what the project aims to help remedy. And because of these barriers is why the project even originally was initiated. The lack of access, who has it? How do you fill it out? What's the ease of use? So really looking at all of these barriers and ideally helping to work through those throughout the project. Next slide. So the current project is 7 counties: Shasta, Fresno, Mariposa, Contra Costa, Monterey, Orange, and Tri-Cities we consider as a county for the purpose of Mental Health Services Act, but that's the cities of Laverne, Pomona, and Claremont. And these 7 entities, which is really interesting because we have tiny counties like Mariposa and large counties like Orange, and each county has its own nuance and its own populations that they want to really highlight, whether it's the college-age population in Tri-Cities or the recently incarcerated in Mariposa. So it's a really great gamut of individuals that each of the counties will really specialize in. And so the project was funded by Mental Health Services Act Prop 63 funding in the innovations component. And the project is really looking to identify a template, utilizing peers, training, technology, legislation, and outcomes. And I'll get into each one of those, but first I'd like to introduce a colleague, Rachel Chambers, who's going to talk about the template and peers. Rachel.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, my name is Rachel Chambers. I'm a peer and a family member. I'm also the co-executive director of Painted Brain, which is a peer-run organization that serves the state of California. I'm really excited to talk about the Innovations Project because it really puts peers in the forefront of creating the Psychiatric Advance Directive and getting feedback on what works and what will not work. And the goal of the project, particularly around the peers, is to really get a standardized template utilizing feedback that we are garnering from individuals across the state, whether that's law enforcement, peers, project coordinators, just all the gamut of individuals that will interact with individual experiencing crisis. We're also looking to create technology that can make it easy to be able to house your pad. Currently, the pad is a paper pad, and we see this as an opportunity to really create some innovation and bring technology to this tool. The other great part is that we're working to create a training template and a curriculum so that we can train other peer support specialists to help individuals with creating their pad. So we see this as an opportunity, once again, to really bring the voice of recovery, to bring technology, to bring peer feedback to the forefront and really getting these psychiatric advance directives disseminated. I'll turn it back over for Karen to talk a little bit more about technology, legislation, and outcomes.
Thank you, Rachel. And so along with what Rachel was saying is they actually, through Painted Brain, created a template which we're looking at as categories. So again, moving away, as she said, from the pen and paper aspect and looking at categories. That was in combination of multiple different pads. There's probably 25 different templates in the United States. And so Painted Brain took 5 or 6 different templates and combined them and then worked in the work groups with the peer voice, as well as law enforcement, to identify what is most needed in the moment for a peer and what is most needed in the moment for law enforcement or first responders, hospitals, and crisis teams. So very exciting to now look at the pads in the way of of components versus and categories versus a pen and paper. The technology is where this really becomes innovative, because currently it is difficult to access a pad unless somebody gives you their 30-page paper document. And so with technology, we were looking at those barriers on how can law enforcement or a first responder or a crisis team receive a pad in the moment, and what information do they even need? Law enforcement has flat out said, we don't need a whole pad. We need to help an individual in the moment. And so we only need a little bit of information, such as what medications are they taking? How do we approach them? What are some positive de-escalation techniques? And who is the support advocate that they have that maybe they've assigned to their pad? So looking at technology as an area to house the pad, and it's not a registry, it's by consent. An individual consents to who has access to their pad. So if they don't want anyone to have access to it, the wonderful aspect of it is it's just housed there for them. But the wonderful aspect also is that if they live in, say, Orange County and move to Fresno, or Fresno and move to Los Angeles, that pad follows them. And so if they encounter a crisis in any of those areas, that pad would be accessible. And so that's what the project's looking at is also how to tie that in. How does a hospital have access? How does law enforcement have access? Plus, an individual can download that paper document or download a PDF, and they can provide it to a mental health practitioner who may be working with them on their case plan. And so that collaboration, but it's all based on individual consent. So that's a very, very exciting aspect. We're working with Chorus Innovations Incorporated, to literally create this technology from the ground up, utilizing first and foremost peer voice, and then also talking to family members, caregivers, and law enforcement or first responders and hospitals. So along that line, we have legislation and really looking at how to make a PAD enforceable. So yes, we have language from 1990, but our peers have voiced that they really want a PAD that is a standalone document that follows them through their life, not planning into life choices, but planning day-to-day life choices and their voice in their day-to-day life. And being able to access that PAD, not just in a crisis, but at any point in their life. But in a crisis, perhaps law enforcement can use that information to help alleviate that crisis, to help reduce that crisis, so it never becomes that crisis, but instead that individual gets the resources that they need. And in doing that, we have to look at outcomes, what works, what doesn't work. And so we're very outcome heavy on every step of the way, looking at the beta testing. How do we roll it out? How does it feel? How does it look? Do the peers like the way it looks and sounds, and do they like the colors even of the platform? So looking at, was it useful? How did law enforcement access it? So all the outcomes that go along with improving a project and improving that ability for it to be used in every county in the state of California. Next slide. So as I talked about components, currently our digital components and categories are current medical conditions, accessibility, crisis team support, treatment preferences, recovery and reentry supports, and dependent preferences. Because oftentimes we are in a crisis and we don't think about, oh my gosh, someone needs to feed my pets, or I want my children to go to my mother. And so really looking at all of these different categories, and Painted Brain went back to the table with their peers and as well as with CAMPRO, and identified recovery language. So not moving away from that medical model, but looking really at recovery language within all of these categories. Next slide. And so when we look at what the technology could potentially look like, these are all drafts because we are working with the peers and first responders and hospitals in creating that actual usable information. But it's also looking at, for example, we have Richard here, and it's looking at, he is not always in crisis. So who is he when he's not in crisis? And then the ability to address his concerns and his preferences when he is in crisis. So really reminding, which is lovely, honestly, about having someone's picture, is to really be able to identify, this is who Richard is. And so next slide. Being able to identify what Richard has chosen, who he's chosen, what his information is. How do we get that information in the moment? One of the great things about technology is you can determine the consent to share. You can determine the date that it was completed, so that if it's downloaded, it will always have a date that says this was filled out on such and such a date, so that if it's not easily accessible in a cloud-based, but someone has given that paperwork to a different care provider, it can have the date on it, and they can ask, is this your most updated PAD? If not, download another one and provide that. So really being able to always keep it up to date and in the moment. And another wonderful aspect of it is not only can Richard contact if he's in a crisis, he can activate all advocates as this mock-up shows, but law enforcement, if you look on the next slide. Oh, back one. Sorry about that. Law enforcement can do the same thing. So we have it, so there's the ability where law enforcement will have a tab and hospitals will have a tab, so that they also can just get what they need in the moment. So we're thinking that because of technology, we can aggregate it all into a summary format. Again, what is the most important information they need, and who do they want to contact? So you can contact all advocates, or you can contact your primary healthcare provider or your healthcare advocate. So a lot of choices come with technology, which is really what moves us forward with PADS in California. Now the next slide. So we look at recognition, and as Dari said before, how do we promote PADS in California? And through an extensive process of working with our peers, first and foremost, the peers decided, and then we talked to law enforcement to identify, and they were 100% aligned, which is amazing and awesome, with this particular image. So this image with the word Psychiatric Advance Directives are the image for our project going forward. And so it will be on everything. It will be on our app. It will be what we train law enforcement to look for. Ask somebody if do they know this image? Ask if they have a pad. And so that goes with the marketing aspect of a new project, and a new ability to recognize pads in California is really branding that icon to say, I have this. This is what it looks like, and I want you to recognize it. And so we would be training law enforcement. We would be training hospitals. This is what it looks like. This is how you access it. Now, My Voice, My Choices, a tagline, is still being worked out by our peer groups. But we want to show that it's going to be a simple tagline. It's going to be something that recognizes this is my Psychiatric Advance Directive. It doesn't belong to anybody else, but this belongs to me. And so PADS recognition is a big part of our project as well. Next slide. And with that, I pass it back over to Dari. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I'll try one more time. Thanks, Karen. I don't think I'm on mute anymore. So earlier, I talked a little bit about my experience of seeing PADS implemented. And what I would say is what works is the process of completing the PAD with the individual, because that's, of course, done in one or many sessions. And, if the appropriate supports are in place. And I do want to clarify, I did assist clients with completing PADs, but you don't need a lawyer to complete a PAD. I found that was a very positive experience for my clients, because it gave them an opportunity to think through the many, many decisions and questions about their preferences that can come up during the course of their treatment and during a crisis. And I think when we talk about what can be improved, it's many of the issues, or all of the issues that Karen just addressed. Ultimately, it's about how do we get other players to recognize the PAD and to respect it and follow it to the greatest extent possible. But I want to invite my colleague, Rachel Johnson Yates, to join me in this conversation, because, of course, I have a legal background, but Rachel has a clinical background, and I think that's so significant to this conversation.
Thanks, Dari. One of the most important aspects of PAD development is, I think, first and foremost, ensuring that the entire team understands what a PAD is, so that no matter which position on a treatment team that you might be, that you're able to effectively speak to the importance of a PAD and help educate a client that maybe has never had a conversation about a PAD on how it might be able to benefit them. And, I have seen all ranges of practice from implementation that was really, really strong to in practice seeing folks having it as kind of a check mark list on an intake. And they'll say to a person something to the effect of, do you have a Psychiatric Advance Directive? And the client will say, well, what's that? And the individual will say, well, if you had one, you'd know what it was. So I'm just going to say no. And that's the end of the conversation. And unfortunately, that is relatively common in practice at this point today. And I really appreciate all the work that the Innovation Project in particular is doing to help move the needle on that, because this is such an important tool. All right. And with that, if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. My name is Rachel Johnson Yates. I am a senior consultant with Health Management Associates, and I am a licensed mental health counselor and a licensed addiction counselor. I have spent all of my career advocating for folks who have been in the mental health and substance use disorder treatment system, especially for those who have been system involved, justice involved, court involved. And this has taken place in my roles as the Deputy Commissioner and Chief of Staff for Indiana's Division of Mental Health and Addiction, as well as my many years practice in the provider space, both in the nonprofit world and in inpatient psychiatric hospital settings. So I'm really glad to be here today and to talk more about this topic with all of you. Next slide, please. So as my colleagues have mentioned, and as Kieran and Rachel very well articulated, PADS are a really, really important tool to be used for anybody that is undergoing any level of psychiatric treatment. We have been being asked quite a bit, help us understand what the requirements are for PADS in the care process. And what's really important to understand as we navigate this space is that the language in the statute around PADS is relatively limited, and we'll get into that in a moment. But what we are hoping to do is to bring to all of the care project implementation teams really an opportunity to think at the beginning about how to weave in this best practice for their clients. And so again, PADS the conversation around PADS can start at any point in which the client has decision-making capacity. And it will be really important for all of our implementation teams to be thinking about how will we build this into our process. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the mechanics of how that might look here in a few minutes. But I really challenge and encourage all of you that are listening today to be thinking to number one, understand the importance of this tool. And then number two, think about how might we be able to take our practice, especially for the care participants who are likely to be individuals that are feeling really overwhelmed, that have had really difficult and traumatic care experiences, especially with any sort of involuntary commitment. How might we be able to implement PADS and other best practices in order to help them feel more safe, more in control, and to have their preferences honored as they go through the care process journey? Next slide, please. So PADS are specifically mentioned around the time of graduation. And the statute references and states that at the end of the care program, the involved parties can develop a graduation plan. A graduation plan is a voluntary agreement that includes a strategy to support a successful transition out of court jurisdiction. The graduation plan may include a psychiatric advance directive. And then a few words later, it says that the psychiatric advance directive shall have the force of law. And so with this, it really does speak to the importance of recognizing and acknowledging and utilizing preferences in the PAD. And so although in the statute, it only mentions the PAD around the time of graduation, it is really, really important to understand that conversations around PAD development should be happening early on in a client's care process involvement in order to be able to help them get their questions answered, help them really establish their preferences, and ensure that the right people have access to the PAD as they go through the care process journey. Next slide, please. So as we know, it is really, really important that we humanize the individuals that will be participating in the care process as we talk about concepts like PAD development. And so here I want to bring to mind an individual vignette named Alex. Alex is a person who is living with schizoaffective disorder and alcohol use disorder and has a history of involuntary psychiatric hospitalizations, which we know can be very traumatic experiences for individuals. Alex identified her volunteer supporter as Sam, who is a peer support specialist. Alex has voiced that certain prescribed medications have caused her significant side effects. She prefers psychiatric hospitals where she has had the best outcomes. And she's proceeded through the care process and has participated in the development of a care agreement with the help of Sam, the BH agency, and Alex's counsel. At this point, she does not have a PAD or a power of attorney in place. And so I would love if you'd be able to just, as we're talking our way through this section, to be keeping Alex in mind and think about how in your practice and in your role that you would approach Alex about developing a PAD. Next slide, please. So again, it is really, really important that we talk about the win of creating a PAD. PAD should be created early so that they can be used as a communication and planning tool throughout the care process. If a care plan agreement is being developed, a PAD can be addressed there as well. So really at the beginning of the engagement in the care process, there are a lot of opportunities where we can start having this conversation about the development of a PAD. And each care team will have to decide whose responsibility that is, what that process will look like, and where that conversation is started, what sorts of checks and balances will be in place to make sure that PADs are being developed, and that the right members of the team, with the client's consent, have access to the pad. So it's important also to remember that although a pad is only specifically called out in relation to the graduation plan, that we again can develop it at any time. The client, though, keep in mind, should be able to have the capacity to engage in a supported decision-making process in the development of a pad. It's also important to revisit the pad often. And so that can look a number of ways. And so it may be that we build in intentional checkpoints within the treatment process for the individual. Maybe it's at the time of treatment plan update. Maybe there's a monthly alert that tells us, oh, it's time to look at the pad with the client. And again, this should be used as a communication and collaboration tool, not only in the time of crisis, but throughout the client's treatment journey. And so when you're making treatment decisions, make it a practice to pull out the pad and say to the person that you're working with, okay, your pad indicates XYZ. Is this still the plan that you would like us to go in? And if the client indicates a discrepancy in that manner, that might be an opportunity to discuss whether what is in the pad is still correct and still what the client prefers, and or if there's modifications that need to be made there. So really, really be thinking about how you might build this into the process in a way that is measured and is intentional, and that there are checks and balances to make sure that it's talked about early and it's revisited often throughout the client's care journey. And so bringing our thoughts back to Alex, she has progressed in the care proceedings to the point of completing a care agreement, and again, does not have a completed pad. There could have been instances earlier in the process where Alex could have been engaged to complete a pad, like when she was assessed by the BH agency. But this current time is a great time to start that conversation. And it should continue to be a discussion. If her preferences change, and they often do, the pad should be revoked and then updated. And keep in mind that even if she doesn't want to create a pad at the beginning or at the present moment, that conversation should be able to be revisited. Next slide, please. So let's talk about when to use a pad. So again, this pad is intended to be kind of a lifetime tool that we're working with individuals when we're working with individuals to help support their treatment and help support their autonomy. Again, it should not be used when the individual is demonstrating a lack of capacity to make decisions. However, with the client's consent, it doesn't just sit on the shelf. And it's really important to remember that even when a person has a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, and even when they are exhibiting maybe some symptoms associated with that mental health concern or other mental health concerns, that does not necessarily indicate that they lack the ability to make decisions. So even in periods where there are some psychotic symptoms, the client may still have the capacity for decision making. And it's really important that the identified members of your team, usually a psychiatrist, are working really, really closely with the treatment team to help make sure we're keeping an eye on that ability to participate in decision making, and that we aren't unilaterally deciding whether or not a person has decision making capability for engagement in the PAD process. For Alex, this might mean informing what goes into the care agreement or plan, and it's going to allow her to stipulate what her preferences are if there's a crisis point. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk a little bit about who can help create a PAD. So the most important thing to remember is who helps create a PAD is the person or people that the client chooses. So the client is the central force in the development of the PAD. Their preferences, their privacy preferences and concerns are really at the core of all of the work that we're doing here. And so as we're talking about this, keep in mind that peers, peer specialists, family members, trained facilitators, volunteer supporters, case managers or counselors, faith leaders, or a number of other people are able to help create a PAD. And it's really, really important that, if possible, the individual helping create the PAD ideally will understand the mental health treatment landscape. They will be able to help the client navigate their own treatment history and preferences, perhaps helping them have access to past treatment records or medication records. They can offer examples or help the client talk through their treatment journey in terms of what things have and have not worked with them. And they have some sort of understanding around general mental health conditions, and it's especially good if they understand schizophrenia or psychosis spectrum related disorders. And at this point, I would love to hear from Rachel again around how the importance of who you pick to help you create a PAD plays out in real life experiences. Rachel?
Thank you, Rachel. As an individual with lived mental health experience, an individual that has a PAD, it was really important for me to find someone that, like Rachel said, that understood the mental health field landscape, preferably someone that has went through a psychiatric crisis or has, navigated the mental health system. Is preferably. That's why Painted Brain and Campril has been actively advocating for the use of peer support specialists. It's also important for you to be able to select someone that's able to build rapport and to meet you where you're at. So like Rachel said, a number of individuals can support you, but it's really important to select someone that'll let you take the seat, the driver's seat, and really be able to articulate your treatment needs and wants for yourself. So yeah, I think it's really important that you really take time or get support from a trained individual that can help you create your PAD. And we know that peer specialists will be more effective in meeting people where they're at because we understand what they're going through. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. And I love what you said there around how important it is to pick the right person for you to be able to help navigate the process. We have all had experiences where we are filling out documentation or paperwork, at some sort of a medical mental health provider agency, where the paperwork feels a little bit overwhelming. And so anytime that we can have a partner there who is well-versed in the forms and the process, that feels really great. And again, peers, family members, trained facilitators, volunteer supporters, case managers, faith leaders, really anyone who kind of understands the mental health framework, understands the personal situation with the individual, and can help them navigate past and future treatment experiences and preferences can be part of this. But again, to reiterate, the client is the driving factor of who helps them in the PAD development process. Next slide, please. So who should have access to a PAD? And so what's really important here is that, again, based on consent, a PAD can be provided to anybody that the individual deems is appropriate. And this could include local first responders, preferred hospital medical system, the BH agency, family members, volunteer supporters, peer support specialists, the respondents council. Any number of these individuals could be somebody that the client believes it would be beneficial for them to have access to the PAD. If you are an individual helping a person navigate the PAD, it's really important that we come up with a list that we can use as a guide for conversation with the client that we're helping. It's really hard if you're developing a PAD for the first time, you're under the stress of being involved in mental health treatment. Perhaps you're having some active symptomology that is making recall and planning feel a little bit more difficult. If we are able to have a list like this available and help the client use this as a frame of reference in terms of selecting who they want to have access to the PAD, that is really a great practice to have. And in terms of HIPAA and release of information, ideally the PAD is going to include consent if a release of information is required, including in the time of crisis. And so it may have language that says, I authorize the sharing of the PAD and my treatment history for the purposes of medical or mental health treatment, so that we're able to, on the front end, have some information around what sort of individuals or entities need to have access to that, and that it's still protecting the client's privacy, and it's on a need-to-know basis, but that those consents are addressed at the front end at the front end. So if we do enter a time of crisis, that we know how to navigate it. Again, right now, there are some limitations to ease of sharing of pads, and our friends at the Innovation Project are really, really working to help streamline that process. And again, it is really important to remember that if a pad is revoked, the best is, as we're able to maintain a list of who has a copy of that pad so that we can ensure that they get the updated pad is something that's really, really important to ensure that the tenets of the pad are honored as needed. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about how to approach a pad. And there are a few steps to this. One, we want to provide education on what a pad is and is not. We want to ensure that the choices that we are putting in the pad reflect the language and the cultural preferences of the individual. And so if there are family members that should be contacted in a time of crisis, or if there are non-traditional cultural supports that need to be incorporated, all of that should be encouraged and honored. We want to ensure that we're using supported decision-making to come alongside the client to help them navigate their own path to the decision that is best and preferred for them. It takes a trauma-informed approach, which means it is not rushed, that we are patient, that even if we have developed a pad 1,000 times, that we are creating the space for this to be the first time that a client has ever learned about a pad, and that we develop it intentionally. And so, if there are checkboxes on the form, that it's not a rushed, quick checkbox sort of process, but that we talk through the client around what each selection means, and that we help them really navigate the choices that will help them feel confident in the decisions that they're making. We'd love to hear from Rachel again. Can you talk to us a little, Rachel, about the importance about how to approach a pad in a way that really honors the voice of the client?
Yes, thank you. And I can talk from my personal experience. Since I did have a peer and a lawyer that supported me, I think the way you educate someone and utilizing recovery and empowerment strengths-based language, like someone approached me basically saying like, this document will protect you. This is an empowerment tool. And I was like, okay, this document's going to protect me. So I was like, okay, what is this? So I think that that's also a really important piece to like, of course, meeting the individual client where they're at, but really utilizing a strengths-based approach, an empowerment approach when educating an individual about it. And then also being able to look at that trauma-informed lens. Like when I went through my Psychiatric Advance Directive, and it was Rachel was saying, and Dari, it's going to be multiple processes. So it's just educating the person, like, it could potentially take a number of sessions, and it might bring up some things that can be potentially triggering, because literally I was so triggered by just reflecting on the medications that I took and then bringing me back and having to think about my hospitalizations. And then also having to think through where I was going to what I was going to do with my pets was also trauma and triggering. So just being able to work with the individual and meeting them where they're at is really important, and just making the time. It's really not a checkbox approach. This really takes a number of sessions and intention. It might require pulling some medical records. So just being intentional, meet the person where they're at. And if the person needs a break, like I needed a break, give them time. So yeah, I think that those are like some of the high level approaches to how I was able to successfully complete my pad. But definitely it was trauma it was trauma engaging.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you. No, and I love what you said there about the way that you phrased it as an empowerment tool that helps protect you. And I think if we, as practitioners, as people that are involved in the development of the court process, truly are employing and committed to a client-centered approach to the care process and to the care that we offer the folks that we work with in general, the PAD is really a core tool in terms of embodying those beliefs and those commitments. And so when you think about a PAD, it truly is an empowerment tool. It is an opportunity for the client to feel safer and to feel protected and to feel like this is a mechanism for their wishes and preferences to be honored. And I think that is just incredibly important. So Rachel, thank you so much for sharing that. Next slide, please. So let's talk now a little bit about the what's, and we're going to start with what should be included. And so if your PAD is embedded in an advanced health care directive that you are wanting to register with the state, which is an option, that isn't an option that is a fit for everyone, but if that is a direction that an individual might want to go, it has to include the date of execution, has to be signed by the person or in the person's name by another adult in the person's presence and at the person's direction. And it has to be signed by at least 2 witnesses. In general, preferences that should be included have to reflect both general and unique needs. And some examples of this, and this is a very limited list. There's a lot of other things that can go into this, and we'll hear from Rachel again in a moment. But we want to talk about what sorts of de-escalation techniques are effective for the individual. What sorts of treatment do they prefer, and what works for them if they are starting to have a need for different or increased treatment? Who in their world is allowed to receive their medical or mental health information? And if there is a time of crisis, what happens to their dependents or pets? How can you really proactively think to make sure that we have those arrangements made on the front end in case that there is a situation that emerges where that we have to make arrangements according to a person's dependents or pets? Rachel, would you talk a little bit more about other things that we might be able to be thoughtful to include in a PAD?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to highlight, of course, all those things that you mentioned, because those are like some of the common things that I actually had to recently most think about when I voluntarily put myself in a hospital. So what was I going to do with my dog? How was my son going to get to school? Who was going to pick them up? Also, there can be reproductive rights added. So if you're a woman or a person that's pregnant and find yourself in a crisis, you can put your wishes in a Psychiatric Advance Directive to support you. And there's housing, education. If you're in school, there you can add your accommodations, or also you can add, like, if I'm in a crisis, who's going to contact my teacher so that, I don't get kicked out of class. I mean, I hear that so many times of individuals are in crisis, and then, they get failed out of school. So, and their life spirals downhill. So definitely being able to include housing, education, medication treatments, gender affirming practices in there. It can, Karen mentioned a lot of those sections in the previous slide, but it's really real in practice as a peer individual with lived experience. And the PAD really is a blueprint to how you're not just a crisis, but your treatment.
Rachel, thank you so much, because I think really, I think you're speaking well to the need to be really intentional, number one, about the forms that you are utilizing. And we're going to give you a couple examples here in a few minutes. And then again, the Innovations Project is working on some templates that have pulled from a lot of different other templates that really have the intention of capturing all of these holistic needs that a person may have. But this also speaks to the need to be intentional about development of the form, and that it's not only treatment preferences, but it's about everything else that is happening in that person's very three-dimensional world that they're living in. And how do we make sure that, if there is a need for hospitalization or other sort of crisis intervention, that their world is able to be maintained while they're taking the time to stabilize. Next slide, please. So here's one example that can be built upon. So this is the California Advanced Health Directive form. And while this is not a PAD specifically, it can give some frame of reference for helping create some templates for a PAD, and can be used to indicate some aspects of an individual's choices should a crisis occur. And so on this form, and the link is below, you'll see that it covers choices related to healthcare agents, court-appointed conservators, facility and physician preferences, choices for avoiding emergency situations and emergency interventions, choices around visitation, medication, treatment preferences. And it also has a space to indicate a person's desires, special provisions, and limitations. So this may be if you're a group that is saying, gosh, we really need to get moving on development of a PAD. This could be a place to start figuring out what pathway that you want to take. Next slide, please. And another potential resource is from SAMHSA. And so SAMHSA has a practical guide to psychiatric advance directives, a document that's linked at the bottom of this slide. And on that link has a template for a psychiatric advance directive specifically. And then they also offer a wallet card that a person can carry with them in the time, in case a time of crisis emerges. And they don't have a physical copy of their full PAD. It's an abbreviated version that helps indicate for the people that may be responding to the crisis that a PAD does exist, and who the individual's emergency contacts are, their hospital preferences, and their treatment preferences. And again, with this particular form, there are strengths and there's some areas that might be able to be improved, but it's a great option as you're starting to think about how might I implement PADs in my own team processes. Next slide, please. So here we're going to talk a little bit about some need areas that often come up as we're talking about PAD development. And there's a lot of things that come up for those of us that do this work a lot that are kind of common factors in PAD development. And we picked here just a few that we think are really, really important. Number one, there is a need area around lack of familiarity with PADs, which we talked about a little bit. So again, first and foremost, it's really important that we ensure all staff are well versed in PADs, and that there are multiple plans, times to discuss. There are times to consider plan facilitation sessions with trained facilitators, and that we're creating the time to sit down with our team, number one, because if our team isn't well versed in PADs, then the implementation and utilization of PADs is going to be spotty at best. And then also that we really kind of get our scripts together about how it is that we're going to talk about PADs with the individuals that we're working with. The next need area is assistance in completing the PAD. This is where we ensure that PAD templates are accessible at a variety of reading levels and in multiple languages. We make sure that there are planned facilitation sessions if that's a fit for our operations with trained facilitators, or that our team members are trained well enough that they can facilitate the PAD conversation with the individuals that we're working with. Next is help with PAD content. And this is where it's really helpful to have some example PADs available. A lot of times when we're trying to think through all of our potential options and preferences, that can feel really, really overwhelming. And there's an opportunity to miss some things that might be really, really important. And so if you have a few example PADs available that you're able to pull up and show clients, that might start to be able to get, the ideas flowing so that they are able to really critically think through the options that are preferable for them. Here, and I'm going to tag my colleague Dari here just to speak to this one a little bit more in depth. Ensuring the two witnesses on the PAD development. Dari, do you mind jumping in here real quick and just talking a little bit about the nuance around this point?
Sure. So this comes from California's Advanced Healthcare Directive law, which requires for an advanced healthcare directive that two witnesses sign the PAD. Or if two witnesses are not available, the PAD needs to be notarized. And I do want to point out that if the PAD is being completed electronically, then it does need to be notarized. So again, a PAD is not an advanced healthcare directive, but currently California's Advanced Healthcare Directive statute is the the guiding statute to make sure that the PAD is legally a legally recognized document. So that's where this requirement comes from.
Thanks so much, Daria. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Next is ensuring that the PAD is accessible in a time of crisis. And there's a lot of innovative practices and procedures coming down the pike, but this could be done through use of wallet cards, storage on a person's smartphone, help with creation and completion of a dissemination list, making sure that there's a checklist at the time of treatment plan update to touch base on the PAD, make sure that the items in the PAD are still relevant, and touching base on making sure that everyone that is important in the client's life has a copy of their most recent PAD, and use of health information exchanges. And lastly, we have finding a trusted person to serve as a proxy decision maker. And so this is something that could be a whole other training, but really helping work with the client to identify options around a healthcare advocate or a power of attorney or something similar, helping the client identify options by engaging maybe family members, peers, friends, other potential supports, so that if a situation of crisis does occur, that those individuals are able to make sure that what is in the PAD is known to the treatment providers and honored. Next slide, please. So as we were thinking about this, I would really challenge all of the people attending this webinar to consider where you are in terms of PAD implementation. Is it something that you've talked about yet? Is it something that you're pretty close to having toward implementation? Are you somewhere in the middle of that continuum? Think about how you are planning to integrate a PAD into your current workflows, and thinking about how you will take the PADs and ensure they're disseminated and communicated with the correct people with the client's consent. And with that, I am going to kick it back over to Patricia.
Thank you, Rachel and Kieran, Rachel, Dari, and participants for sharing your perspective and some best practices around psychiatric advance directives. So the goal of this training was that by the end of this session, you would have an increased ability to describe the importance of PADs for documenting client preferences and ultimately supporting client self-determination. We also hope that you're better able to summarize how the person-centered components that could be included in the PAD, and then articulate some steps that you could take for implementing PADs as part of the care process. So we know that you may have follow-up questions or things you want to think through. So on the next slide, I want to outline some next steps. So visit careact.org for different resources, including recordings of trainings, and also to submit questions or TA requests. If you're interested in receiving notifications of trainings, TA, and other engagement opportunities, you can complete the form that's also on our website to join the communication listserv. Again, on the next slide, we just highlight our email address and our website where you can go for more questions. If you can't find what you need, you can always email that resource. And then linked in these notes on the following slide, we have some additional resources if you're interested in learning more, including a video that Painted Brain put together on supported decision-making that really outlines some principles that you can consider. Again, appreciate your time, and please reach out if you have questions. Thank you.